What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another modern video, and today we're going to be looking at the most popular and most played deck in the modern format and really the deck to beat for a couple of reasons which we'll outline as we kind of explain and walk through the deck. Of course, it's been a while since we've seen Izzet Murktide, at least in one of my videos and stuff. Wanted to get some gameplay of it, and really games just kind of go how you would expect them to go playing a deck like this. But before we get too deep into that, of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you're watching this for the first time, I post a lot of modern and pioneer content with some other like essay type videos kind of peppered in there just about the formats in general, cards, and all that stuff. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. In the link in the description, or in the description of this video, there's two links. One goes to my Twitch channel. Go ahead and throw me a follow over there so you can catch live content. Not I don't stream like super often, but it's at least worth going over there and following. So when I do decide to go live, and there's also a link in the description to the Discord server that I run. If you want to follow that link, go ahead and join and talk about Magic. I do like interacting with people, especially like people that leave comments on the video, people that message in like the Discord, ask questions, stuff like that. I like to be very active and hands-on, so yeah, feel free to join. Now, let's go ahead and talk about Izzet Murktide. So this is the most played deck, at least metagame percentage wise, according to MTG Goldfish, and for good reason. Izzet Murktide is probably one of the most consistent decks, and the fact that like when tempo decks are pretty good, like in a format, I think the format is overall healthy, but I think this deck it kind of like borders on it because it does get to play a lot of like the broken things and the very powerful things that are in the format. So at the creatures, like you are very like I mean you're very lean on creatures. You play 14 creatures, but three Dragon Rage Channelers, four Ragavan, four Ledger Shredder, and three Murktide Region. Dragon Rage Channeler, you're playing literally 26 spells that are going to trigger the Dragon Rage Channeler. You're playing 19 lands. Like this all just kind of culminates in getting to keep one land hands that have like a Dragon Rage Channeler and a Mishra's Bauble, because you're gonna get to trigger this, more than likely get it to Delirium like super quick and just have a 3 power creature in play on like turn 2. And again, just like kind of surveil through, make sure you hit your second land drop, and then you're unlocking expressive iterations and counter spells to really just kind of like tempo your opponent out, and eventually, of course, casting a Murktide Regent. Following that up, the other red one drop, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, is probably one of the best one drops that you could play in the format. Period. Obviously, like this card just in itself can just like warps the format around it. It can take over a game on its own. It can generate so much mana. It gets in one or two hits, like you have 4 mana on turn 2, which is insane. And in a deck like this, when like you could like feasibly like turn 2 Ledger Shredder and then play like an expressive iteration, or leave up like counterspell or something like that, on top of like getting to play like a consider and leave up spell pierce and stuff like that. Like there's just so many options, and that's just like if Ragavan is goes unchecked for like a turn or two. Even just like one turn of like Ragavan, like it doesn't even necessarily need to hit a card from your opponent that you care about casting. Just the fact that it gives you extra mana in a deck that wants to double spell as soon as possible, and it gets to do that on turn 2 just by having 3 mana and getting to again maybe play like a Ledger Shredder and like a Consider, Lightning Bolt, so on, or just leave up interaction and like Unholy Heat, possibly like Counterspell, Lightning Bolt, and of course things like that. Ledger Shredder, as we're talking about it and everything, it lets you connive, which basically says you draw a card and discard a card, and if you discard an non-land card, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and you get to do that for when a player casts their second spell each turn. So a lot of the times you get into these games where Ledger Shredder is triggering on multiple times, like a turn cycle, where you're more than likely able to trigger on your turn with the help of like expressive iteration and considers and like these cantrips and stuff that you play, like Mishra's Bauble being a free spell, and then following up with like a 1 mana spell, and getting to leave up like counter spell and things like that. And eventually getting to the point where like Ledger Shredder finds you so many, finds you enough lands for like you're able to trigger it on your turn, get in a big attack, or hold it back, whatever the situation deems, and then trigger it again on your opponent's turn, and then more than likely your opponent triggering it on their turn as well, or even on like your end of turn and whatnot. And just getting to grow the Ledger Shredder so much, you get so much, maybe not necessarily card advantage, but you get a lot of card selection. You're able to sculpt your hand and essentially take over the game that way. Just getting to draw, two, three, four more cards than your opponent can be the difference between winning and losing. And this Izzet deck does it so well, with probably one of the best cantrips that is available to you in the modern format, and along with like the slew of great creatures that you get to play at 1 and 2 mana. Finally, you have Murktide Region, which enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each sorcery card exiled with it. Of course, it is it has Delve, so essentially, like you could play it as a 2 mana 8/8, potentially. It also has an added line of text. Whenever an instant sorcery card leaves your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Murktide Region. So you can kind of set up these turns where like you stock up your graveyard, you play a Murktide Region that doesn't exile like any instant sorceries, and then like you follow it up with a Murktide exiling a bunch of instants and sorceries to make it an 8/8, and then of course you've exiled 5 instants or sorceries, so then the Murktide that's on the battlefield also becomes an 8/8. And while it does leave the first Murktide vulnerable to like removal, it's also one of the most explosive plays because you just put two 8/8s into play essentially. And in a format where Unholy Heat is like the removal spell of choice, there's not really any like hard removal. And even then, like Prismatic Ending doesn't deal with a Murktide region, Fatal Push doesn't deal with a Murktide region. Some combination of like Unholy Heat plus Lightning Bolt will deal with a fully, fully delved Murktide region. But again, they're spending 2 cards to get rid of your 1 card, and this deck puts so many cards in the graveyard where you're actually able to just keep Delirium. So like your Unholy Heats are good, your Dragon Rage Channelers are good, and it can just fuel back up, find another Murktide region, and just play another one and force you to have multiple cards to answer it, on top of having you play through your interaction and counterspell, spell snare, spell pierce. So this is like the power of the deck, right? Like these creatures are super efficient for their cost. Murktide Regent being super big for 2 mana, Ledger Shredder able to get huge over the course of like multiple turns. Like you're not looking to end the game on like turn 3 or turn 4 or even turn 5 with a deck like this, but you are able to like close out games very quickly when you're putting 1 to 2 counters on Ledger Shredder every turn since it comes down. I guess a quick thing too while I'm thinking about it, Ledger Shredder is a great turn 2 play when you have like a Mishra's Bauble. If you already have 2 lands and you're looking at like Shredder Bauble and like Dragon Rage Channeler, a lot of the times I like holding the Bauble so I can trigger like the Ledger Shredder, because then essentially you get to, if your Dragon Rage Channeler lives, you get to uh, Surveil, and then you also get to Connive as well from just one Mishra's Bauble, and of course, you have your Bauble tricks and things like that. So just like some neat interactions and like some things where you can just like maximize the amount of value that this deck can get, and like the card selection to make sure that every single card is, way more impactful than anything that your opponent can play. Um, I alluded to like the spells in this deck. Like consider, just puts cards in your graveyard. Obviously feels like the Murktide can get you to Delirium for Dragon Rage Channeler. Importantly, it's 1 mana instant speed, like does something and then draws a card. It forwards your game plan very well. The fact that it does replace itself means like it's very good with like Ledger Shredder, because you're able to more than likely chain 2 spells together. And of course, like Dragon Rage Channeler, you're getting to constantly surveil and get towards Delirium, to where like this thing is just going to get in and attack your opponent for tons of damage early and often. You have Lightning Bolt, which interacts very well with like the Ragavans, Dragon Rage Channelers, and even like the Ledger Shredders before they get a counter on them. Of course, like you have Hammer Time, where Lightning Bolt kills all of their creatures, along with like Unholy Heat, even if you don't have Delirium. Just getting to play like these 2 efficient removal spells in red when you want to be fetching up like red sources for your creatures is pretty good. You have 1 Spell Pierce and 1 Spell Snare. You could probably play like 2 Spell Pierce or 2 Spell Snare if it asks for it. Maybe 2 Spell Snare is like a lot, but definitely 1 Pierce, 1 Spell Snare. Pierce just ends up being very good. It's an efficient like counter spell essentially. Like if you're able to untap with like a Ragavan. Like if your opponent doesn't do anything to Ragavan on turn one, you play Ragavan, and you don't even draw a second land. Like you more than likely fetched up Steam Vents. So the fact that you're able to attack with Ragavan and make a second mana with like your treasure, leave up Spell Pierce, maybe play like a Dragon Rage Channeler or anything like that, and leave up the treasure token to cast Spell Pierce if you need to, so on, and just overall be annoying. Like Spell Pierce is a very annoying card, and when decks want to like creativity on turn four, they want to like drop hammers and things like that. These popular decks in the format, even like Rhinos getting to like tap out so they can Violent Outburst or Shardless Agent into their Crashing Footfalls. Spell Pierce, just boom, easy answer, done. We move on with life. Um, Counterspell, counter target spell, literally like the cleanest text box that this deck has in terms of cards. That and like Blood Moon, but like Blood Moon's Blood Moon. Counterspell, obviously efficient 2 mana counterspell. With how the format is, counterspell is no longer like I pay 2 mana to like counter your 4, 5, 6 mana spell. It's I'm gonna counter your 1 mana spell, which like back in the day would have been like a 6 mana spell. So it definitely gets its value more from just like being a tempo play and just being able to counter a super powerful threat, kind of like how it's always done, but while you're not getting like the I spent 2 mana to essentially get rid of like 6 mana. You're spending 2 mana sometimes to get rid of like a 0, 1, or 2, but that 0, 1, or 2 is like so powerful that like you end up getting your value that way from like counterspell. As I alluded to in a video coming out very soon, Expressive Iteration probably the best cantrip that you have in the modern format. It more often than not just draws 2 cards. It triggers Dragon Rage Channeler multiple times, depending on what you find with the iteration. It can assure that you hit land drops on like turn three. It can trigger Dragon Rage Channeler. I'm pretty sure I already said that. Fuels Murktide Region. It does a lot. It does a lot for this deck. And again, when you're like have 19 lands and you have like these channelers, shredders that are able to draw you cards under the right circumstances, an expressive iteration which digs down 3 cards, it's more than likely to find another land. You're able to hit land drops very consistently. Find your Otawaras, find your Fire Islets, cash in for a card, get rid of a permanent that kind of sucks to deal with, and just overall kind of like make sure that you hit your land drops while also keeping your hand stocked full of spells. Mishra's Bauble essentially makes this like a 56 card deck, triggering the Dragon Rage Channeler, triggering the Ledger Shredder if you play it on like turn 2, obviously triggering it any other time, but the best Bauble is the one that is where Ledger Shredder like preceded it. This deck in particular decided to play like one Blood Moon. It's playing 3 snow-covered islands, so I mean that's pretty good. Like you can afford to like fetch up blue mana. Really, if you only have like one, I mean you lock yourself out of like Merced Region counterspell, but your deck has so much like card draw and like card advantage and selection and stuff that really, if you fetch up like one island, and of course like your Ragavan treasures. But if you fetch up like one island, I would bet that you're okay uh, blood mooning and kind of going from there. Especially if you can get this down on like turn two, and your opponent can't deal with your Ragavan. Like if they're already having a hard time dealing with it, and you just blood moon them, then they have an extremely hard time, and like you're able just to create treasure tokens to get around the blood moon effect on your side of the board. Sideboard, because the mana base is pretty straightforward. I kind of went over it and explaining the iteration stuff. Engineer Explosives clears up tokens very, very nicely. Alpine Moon messes with like the Tron decks, messes with Urza's Saga and things like that. I believe Alpine Moon just straight up like like just destroys like Urza's Saga. Like if your opponent tries to play a Saga, it is still a Saga, but it doesn't come in with counters, so that means that it dies. Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, just good ways to interact with some of the more like counterspell decks. I would imagine these probably, like some amount of these probably come in the mirror. I would think like Spell Pierce, just from the fact that like this deck is like trying to be super efficient. A braid is extra like removal and random artifacts as I dance around the dress down. That does a lot of things for the decks that try to be like unfair. Dress down, just a nice card to have. It does contribute to like Delirium, triggers Dragon Rage Channeler, so on. But creatures losing all abilities. This is really good against like the Yawgmoth deck because you can like make their creatures lose undying. Obviously, you have to do it before the creatures like trigger. But if you're able to like kind of catch them with like a Yawgmoth on the stack and whatnot, uh, it does make it a little bit harder for them to like go off that way. You can catch like a Grief or a Fury or what have you, even like an Endurance to try to get rid of your graveyard. You can like dress down in response and stop them from tucking your graveyard, which then can lead up to like a Murktide Regent, which I believe still enters with the counters, but then loses all of its abilities because of the dress down. But still it's a big boy. Unlicensed Hearse to mess with other people's graveyards, an additional Blood Moon, two Subtleties, and a Fury. Fury coming in against like the little tiny creature decks slash like hammer. You have Subtlety to basically just like interact with like annoying like planeswalkers and stuff. Like Teferi Time Raveler kind of sucks to play against if you're like playing this deck. Just because like you want to kind of like stick a threat, and the fact that they're so efficient makes it easy to like kind of overwhelm, but at the same time like you're spending turns like getting rid of a planeswalker and your opponent just kind of accruing value and things like that way. So that is the Izzet Murktide deck. A little bit more of an in-depth deck tech, I would say, than what we normally do. Normally we just go over the cards. This just kind of like explaining more or less like why the Murktide deck is so popular, and just the fact that like it's so efficient, it gets to play the best cards in the format. And these cards not looking like they're going away anytime soon. I mean, is unsurprising to me that Murktide continues to be one of the best decks to play in the format, and at least like one of the most consistently played decks in the format. For the fact that I think you don't have to necessarily be a super optimal pilot of this deck, like just playing a Ragavan and it going unchecked. Like anybody could do that. I could get my 4-year-old this deck, and playing against someone who can't interact with Ragavan, and she could probably still win the game. Um, that said, there's a lot of skill and nuance, and if you do play this deck and you work on it, you figure out some of the lines, try to squeeze out as much efficiency and value as you can. Izzet Murktide is a very hard deck to beat. So yeah, that is the Izzet Murktide deck for Modern. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, of course, leave a like on the video. Comment down below if you want to see gameplay of like the Izzet Murktide deck. I can try to fire up Moto again and try to get some good matches of it in. So if that's something that interests you, please let me know in the comments in the video or in Discord, so on and so forth. And of course, consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you can see more videos like this and any other Pioneer or Modern content that I decide to post on the channel. That's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next one.